welcome to the second episode of our podcast, Espresso with the Experts. Today we have the honor to have two great professors from our economics and political science department here at Columbia, Professor Nadia Urbinati and Professor Alessandra Casella. Welcome both, and thank you for being here with us today. Today we're going to discuss the latest manuscript by Professor Urbinati, that she co-authored with Professor Lafont, and the tentative title of the book is Defending Democracy Against Lottocracy. And Professor Casella will help us thinking through these topics, for providing us with her perspective. So let's start with a brief introduction of our speakers. Nadia Urbinati is professor of political theory at Columbia University, and she specializes in modern and contemporary political thought and the democratic and anti-democratic traditions. Professor Urbinati is also permanent visiting professor at Scuola Superiore Sant'Anna, and she taught at Bocconi University in Milan and Sciences Po in Paris. In 2008, the President of the Italian Republic awarded Professor Urbinati with the title of Commendatore della Repubblica. She's also the author of Me, the People, How Populism Transforms Democracy, an award-winning book. And she's also a political columnist for Italian newspapers. Alessandra Casella is professor of economics and of political science at Columbia University. She's also co-director of Columbia CISR, and she is a fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research and the Center for Economic Policy Research. She founded the Columbia Experimental Lab for the Social Sciences, and she is a Guggenheim Fellow and has authored numerous papers published in scholarly journals. Her work is mainly in political economy and experimental economics, and she's well known for having proposed an innovative voting system, storable votes, as she described in her books titled Storable Votes Protecting the Minority Voice. So I think at this point we can start, right? I introduced the topic of the book already, and I've mentioned the words democracy and lottocracy. So at first, this term might seem unfamiliar to most people, right? And so I suggest that we could start from a simple definition of what is lottocracy, where does it come from, and what do you refer to when you think about what you call the lottocratic mentality?
Well, it's a big question. First, thank you very much for having me here. Now, it is the topic of the book. So let's start with lottery and then go to lottocracy. Lottery is part of the democratic tradition since the beginning of democracy in Athens, more than 2,500 years ago. And it's also has been used also after during the important experimentations of early humanist republics in our country, in Italy and elsewhere. And also recently, after the institutionalization of representative government, we use lottery on many occasions, in the administrative, in the justice, for the distribution of scarce goods among people who are in need. So there are many usages of lottocracy. The relationship between lottocracy and representation based on elections is the problem instead. And today, thus, there is a new directions in the experimentations, in the theory, in the imagination, institutional imagination also, because it involves movements and theorists. There is a tendency to correct, combine, amend electoral systems through lottery. So lottery comes to have a new role, which didn't have in ancient Athens, the role of sharing, actually sometimes even substituting elections for decision-making in the domain of lawmaking, of legislation. And this is new. We call this, actually not we, but themselves, the supporters of this view, they call themselves lottocrat, because they want to show that there is the power of lottery instead of the power of election. So now this is the new trend. Not new, but it is an important trend within political theory. In this book, we want to analyze not so much the different proposals, some of them very radical, other of the less radical, but to analyze and to detect and to critically examine the mentality. It's very important because it is not simply wanted to make an experiment, not simply wanted to advance a new drive, but a mentality, meaning a vision of politics, a vision of institutions, and selecting processes that are shaped according to a logic called logic of probability versus logic of choice. And this is truly a mentality because it's a way of interpreting human relations inside of the political domain, not according to the principle of choice, as Robert Dahl said, this is the principle of democracy by elections, but the principle of chance. And this is something new, right?
Thank you very much. Professor Casella, would you like to react to these claims?
Yes, I think that, yes, first of all, thank you for having me here too.
Sure.
And this is an extremely interesting topic, very, very stimulating. Many people see the possibility of having more direct citizen participation in political decision as one way of rejuvenating democracy. So a really important route for reform. I think that Nadia's characterization as the logic of choice versus the logic of chance is a little bit forced. So there is a bit of framing there, and we can discuss it more.
Yeah.
One thing that I wanted to point out is that there are many different ways in which a random choice of citizens and participation in political decisions can be implemented. Yeah. And they seem to me really very, very different. So I would like to ask in the future of this conversation from Nadia whether they can really be assimilated as one underlying logic. So this goes from substituting parliament with citizens that are randomly selected from the population in the most extreme to substituting one of the chambers. And so maybe the Senate would be composed of citizens that are randomly drawn to represent the electorate, to mixing some selected, sorted citizens and elected representatives in a chamber, to having mini-publics, which are assemblies of randomly selected citizens that are convened only for a specialized topic and for a very limited amount of time. So these are very, very different, in my opinion. I'm not sure that they can be combined.
Great. You actually kind of introduced the second question that I prepared for you. So before going deeper into the theoretical discussion and the normative implications of these new, let's say, political institutions, I would like to ask you whether you could talk about some examples of those sorted assemblies, those mini-publics that have been experimented in the past, as you mentioned, Athens, Florence already, up until today. So if we could talk about, let's say, this lottocracy in a concrete way.
Yeah, Alessandra Casella already introduced the topic because it's true. We have to make several important distinctions between replacement, complementarity, and auxiliary. There are two different ways. We don't want to combine or coalesce all of them. We want to make them distinctions. And we assume, our theory about democracy assumes, that auxiliary is absolutely to be welcome because it's a way of rejuvenation, it's a way of putting into the system information that parties, politics don't, because they don't want, because they don't know, because they prefer not to. So it's very important. So having said so, before going through the topic directly, I'd like to mention some examples so we can understand what we are talking about.
Exactly.
So let's talk about examples of mixing the lottery and elections in the formation of the parliament with the two chamber or the Congress with the two chambers kind of. There have been different different proposals about that. Recently, for instance, Mélenchon in 2017 or Beppe Grillo later on, they propose exactly that, to have the Senate generally and the chambers in a different way formed. More recently, theorists, a Canadian theorist also proposed to do the same with the Canadian parliamentary system. Now the Senate is appointed or nominated by the Council, the President of the Council. And moreover, there are other examples also. For instance, in 1985, here from the States, there came a proposals of having 435 representatives in the House of Representatives sorted by election here, 1985. In England, after Tony Blair proposed to abolish the Chamber of Lords, also the founder of Open Democracy.com also .net, also proposed to have the new chamber sorted by lottery. Other examples outside of these mix are in relation to using lottery in other domains, not necessarily and only political. Think about the European Unions. There are proposals concerning nominating the constitutional courts and the very courts that the European Union has through lottery, also through lottery to form one of the chambers inside of the parliament, not to make decisions, but to decide on non-political issues that the parliamentarians should discuss. For instance, about their salary, about how to invest resources that they have, not to let them do that because they are parte in causa, that is, they are not impartial. Or think about another important that I don't want to go on, but a very important one, to allocate, for instance, to allocate scarce goods within a community outside of the legislature. The Swiss case, the Swiss cantons, they use lottery very frequently. Or the European Union also used lottery to decide between Amsterdam and Milan concerning the location of an important EU agency, and so on and so forth. But also important is another element, and this will come up perhaps during conversation, the use of lottery in situations of radical conflicts. For instance, at the beginning of, after a civil war, the case of Yugoslavia, where parties are not at all capable of coming to an agreement immediately, an important experimentation has been made to introduce indeed sortitions in order to have at least preserve the principle of equality and to block the illicit influences of the two or the three inimical parties. So there are, or other examples are the usage of lottery in the case of a change of the Irish constitutions on abortions. The citizens were consulted through lottery. So there have been many important experimentations. Finally, just to finish this long list, yes, the mini publics are also important, or the randomly selected citizens. Cases, Oregon or the British Columbia, examples very important to show what the citizens, after a chosen citizens, selected citizens through lottery, after a tutored discussions of a specific topic, one topic, they come to a conclusion almost unanimous with a very small minority, and they can be very helpful to give citizens an opinion, which is competent, a voice, and also helpful. So there are many cases, Lars.
Cool. Thank you very much. Professor Casella, you had the chance to observe the works of the French Citizens Convention on Climate. Would you like to talk a little bit about that, about your experience?
Yes. And if I can abuse my position for a second, I wanted to add something to what Professor Urbinati said. What is the logic of these lotteries, of the sortition? The logic is one of representation, because it could be that our listeners haven't really thought about this before or could find this absolutely outrageous that a representative could be chosen by lottery. But imagine a situation in which you have a number of districts and you have a minority that is 20% in each district. And imagine that you have a winner take all, first past the post system. So whoever gets the majority in each district is elected representative. This minority of 20% of the country in this system, which is not a crazy system, it's the American system, it's the UK system, would have no representation. With a lottery, you expect that over the entire population, about 20% of citizens that belong to this minority would be chosen. So the lottery is supposed to be a fair and simple and cheap way of creating a body that is a true representative of the population. And this true is important. And that's where Nadia and I I'm not sure I disagree, actually. But Nadia has very strong opinions about the fact that this wouldn't be true. But first of all, let's get the logic straight.
Yeah.
So talking about the Citizens' Convention on Climate in France, this was a wonderful experience for me. This is an example of a mini public. So it was a reunion of 150 plus random French citizens that were selected from a sample of 300,000 that were, again, selected randomly, but with criteria of representativeness in terms of age, education, geographical location, etc. And they were asked by President Macron to deliberate for a period of about 6 months, but meeting 2.5 days per month, the weekend, paid in Paris. And they would meet and they would discuss possible law proposals that would ameliorate, that would improve France's position relative to climate change. So what needs to be done? Incredibly ambitious task, incredibly ambitious. And they had experts that were helping them decide. They were animators that were helping them organize. I can tell you more about how the assembly was structured, the groups, etc. I went there as an observer on one weekend, so I cannot claim, any deep knowledge. But I was very struck because I came as an economist and I was extremely skeptical. There is a problem of selection, self-selection, right? You are not obliged to go to this. So who are the people who are willing to sacrifice 2.5 days a month for 6 months, which then became longer because of COVID, to this? How will they influence others? What's the power of rhetoric? I mean, someone will be good speakers and others will not be good speakers. Yeah. So do they really all have a voice? What's the role of the animators? How much can they actually channel what their discussion goes? How inefficient can this process possibly be? Right? What's the role of the expert, et cetera, et cetera? All of those doubts. So I came in with all of these doubts, and it was a splendid weekend. People were so invested, were so extremely invested. They were taking it so seriously. Yes, it was rather inefficient, as far as I can tell, but there was a tremendous amount of work and goodwill and seriousness. And so that really made an impression on me. All my prior economic concerns really didn't really materialize. Plus, there was the fact that they all had a tag with written citoyen, and I thought I was in the French Revolution walking around all the citoyens, so that was wonderful.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing this. So we already talked about this, but I wanted to go deeper into this topic of human choice versus chance. Let's say that with the word lottocracy, we're kind of talking about the kratos of pure chance, right? And the idea is that those assemblies, since they're formed through lotteries, they get rid of human behavior and human choice. And with this, lottocrats claim that we can get rid of all the things that come with human behavior and human choice, which can be manipulation, corruption, and discrimination. And this leads to something that Alessandra already mentioned, the idea of this representation that sometimes with the system that we have doesn't really work. So with pure lotteries, we get to this idea of representation as embodiment. Right? Because that's performed through lottery, through chance. So what do you think is fundamentally wrong about this idea of lottocratic equality? And what do you think is fundamentally wrong in the idea of representation as embodiment?
In the idea of lottery, there is nothing wrong. Actually, it's very important. But the question is how to apply it in a system that is based on representation, that is the entire system is based on representation. So we are not in a direct democracy situation like in Athens. In Athens, they didn't use lottery to make laws. Yes, they use lottery to organize councils or the equivalent of constitutional courts to check, but never they enter into the making, discussing in the... So if we want to put lottery inside of representation, we have to face problems. And we have to be ready to face problems, which are first on concerning representation. Of course, we need to have the representation of all the citizens, possibly all of them, not simply some. And thus, the issue exists of how to form parties or participants in the electoral system that are stimulated or invited to or incentivized to have this plurality. We had many examples in existing democracy, parité or stimulations to money. The citizens should be present, not simply their own partisan idea. Fine. But this is one thing. The other thing is to use representation. Sartori was very good in making these distinctions, and I'm trying to repeat him in this case, to make a distinction between representation as sociological representation, that is mirroring, and representation as political representation, selecting issues and thus competing for those issues. This is called generally, in technically speaking, mandate political representation. Now, the lottery allows us to have a sociological representation, particularly when it's associated with the sample, the statistical samples of the population, which is decided according to strategies that needs to be explained. Why women of that age and not the other one? Why this and that? So that is an issue. It is a discretionary issue that can change the outcome. So, second, sociological representation wants to have similarity. I am like you. Wants to have similarity of the representative. Similarity serves to give information, not to make decision. That is, as Picking used to say, representation implies not simply to be like. Actually, they're not like. We don't want to have representatives like us. We do have them different sometimes. How much difference? This is an issue. We had to keep it up. So it means that to be like is a way of giving information. Representation is to act for and to do things. This is different. And so when it is one topic. The second topic, this is very important, what Casella said before concerning the experiment in Paris, is the following. Now, lottery implies that some will rule instead of all, because they are those sorted, not everybody, right? The question is, if it's so good for those who are sorted, selected, they are so good to see them, how invested they are, how creative they are. Why cannot we have it all for us? Why only them? And according to a choice that excludes us. Because, of course, lottery is not simply claiming for equality, but needs to exclude. Because we cannot, and the question is the criterion of exclusion. So we are ready to accept better a criterion that excludes according to fortuna chance, than a criterion that excludes according to the choice. And this is the real issue.
Professor Casella, how group make decisions is a core subject, not only in political philosophy, but also in social choice theory. And you are an expert in that. So what do we learn from formal theory works on mini-publics?
So it's an interesting question. I think that there is a lot of work in political philosophy, and that's clearly what we are hearing from Nadia Urbinati, and it's fundamentally important. But political philosophy tends to have a normative perspective, right? Whereas economists in particular tend to have a more positive perspective. How do things really work? So it is nice for me to see economists starting to work on things like mini-publics. And this is really mini-public. So I'm not talking about the assemblies. That also means, for example, that there is no problem of agenda because the mini-public is specialized to a specific topic. So there is an important paper, beautiful, beautiful paper by two young economists called Ariada Bardi and Nina Bobkova, and it's a paper on mini-publics. And there, the main concern they find the mini-publics don't work very well. And their problem is the uncertainty over the commitment of the executive. So you are asked to make a serious investment in time and cost in learning about an issue, but you are not sure that what the mini-public deliberates decides is going to be applied by the executive. And this, by the way, became a real issue in France with the Citizens' Convention on the Climate. And we can talk about it if you want. I mean, as I said, there was also COVID, but there was also some lack of transparency about how committed the president really was. One interesting aspect of that work, and maybe that would interest Professor Urbinati as well, is the fact that what they find from a normative point of view is that you should have overrepresentation of position at the margin. So you should overrepresent groups that tend to be further away from the median voter, from the consensus. And the reason is because these are the groups that have more incentive to actually make investment because their own views are unlikely to be represented. And once they make more investment, then the others will make more investment as well. And so to overcome this fear of people not gathering enough information because they are not sure that the executive will actually implement their decision, this is one way out.
So
very
basically
interesting.
The statistical part of it's important.
Yes.
The sampling.
This is a paper I love. It's great work, beautiful. Read it, everybody. However, this was not what I saw in my weekend at the convention, where people were perfectly happy to invest. So I don't know if that's a real fundamental problem.
Thank you. I would like to go on with this contrast between elections and lottery, elected politicians versus sorted assemblies. A question that I have that it's very important in political theory, in formal theory, is the question of accountability. Okay, so what can we say about how can these people be held accountable, and do they need to be held accountable if they're just, like us, as you were mentioning, a mirror? So what's your take on that?
Yeah, this is the real issue, in fact. The issue why it's so complicated, the relationship between lottery and lawmaking, is that we are going to, in this case, suppose that this happens systematically in our societies, we would be asked to actually impose to obey laws that people presumably like us, what does it mean to be like us? I don't know, make decisions in the name of us. This is not enough in the name of us that they make decisions because they are like us. So this is a jump that needs to be contained. Let me say something that today, why is so important this topic? It is important because it comes within a moment, in my view, and not only my view, it's a general assumption now, that the crisis of representative democracy that it is now is evident. It's evident by many elements. So people don't go to vote. People disclaim actually the parties as an agent of their own representations. People consider themselves people, we the citizen, all of us, not simply the people. We consider the institutions as something occupied by a political class, separated from us. So how to solve this? And the lottocrats say, leaving aside, eliminate the separation between them and us, when we can do so, because we make us there. Us meaning copies of us, similarity of people of us, and in this way, we solve the problem of the gap. Now, I think that the gap is important. In representative government, representative democracy, the question of controlling, monitoring is what the citizens do on politics. We cannot do politics every day, every time, every moment. We need somebody doing this as a division of labor. The question is how to monitor them, controlling them, and kick them off if needed at the end of. And this is called accountability.
Yeah, the idea that the elections serve as
exactly.
a tool to
One
punish.
may say, and they say, the lottocrats say, well, this is a contradiction because if you want lawmakers to be, or representatives to be accountable to you, you want him or her to come up for re-election so every time, because in this way, right? So the paradox is that you want them there forever. So they become a kind of caste, or which is not good, of course, for accountability. So the real issue does, and this is the reason why politics is so interesting, because it's not a 1 + 1 is 2. It's complicated and imposes on us some strategic interventions, sometimes in one way, sometimes differently. Never assume that this gap is measurable once for all, as they would like to.
Professor Casella, do you have some reactions on this topic of accountability?
I think my favorite interpretation of sortition is for the mini publics. And so with the mini publics, the problem doesn't exist.
Exactly.
It's really auxiliary, as was discussed before, and it's a recommendation that then enters the political system. But there are other concerns. So one obvious concern is, what's the purpose of the mini publics over what the experts are going to tell you? Yeah. Or polls. If it's just information, you can run a poll. You don't need to have a mini public. So I think that there is the danger that mini public be used to legitimize power. So it's not by chance that the Citizens Convention on climate came at the end of the Gilets jaunes, and a clear effort, possibly very irrational and possibly appropriate, I don't know, by President Macron to reacquire the trust, or some of the trust. Well, right now it's not going so well, but anyway, of the citizens through that. But
this topic became
what is the goal?
Very hot because of this crisis of partisanship of parties, of electoral politics in general, right? Yeah. And another topic which is still linked to accountability somehow is the idea that election can be seen not only as a way to punish, let's say, bad politicians, but also as a way to select the best politicians, right? The most competent ones. But today, many people would claim that politicians are actually not better than the average citizens. And even like technocrats with their technical competence have proven not to be able to solve many of our challenges as society's problems. So introducing certain assemblies where there is no selection, so to speak, might be a way to solve this. And this might also explain why actually many people have welcomed mini publics and sorted assemblies in a positive way. So the idea is that how do we relate this to the concept of meritocracy, and what do we think about this idea of selecting somebody that represents us, which is not just like us, but it's different somehow?
Well, this has to do with a conceptualization of politics in situations of constitutional democracies and representations. So you cannot simply do what you want, not whatever it takes. You cannot do that. There are things you can't. And this is very important because it is the limits of politics and power, and the limit also of expertise. Because expertise is, if you assume it consistently, it cannot make compromises. But politics is based on compromises. It needs to be based on compromises. So most of our technocratic leaders, in fact, they have to become compromising somehow if they want to survive. Otherwise, they resign, they abandon, because there is no way out. So politics has its specificity that has to do, particularly electoral politics, not radical or revolutionary politics, which doesn't know compromise of. But compromise is the salt of democracy and representation. Now, competence. Here too, what is exactly competence? Because when we use the word competence, we seem to know already what is that. I don't know exactly what it is in politics. I know what it is in science, in chemistry, in whatever. But politics is something. So when we go to vote, if parties work well and they are not simply catch-all parties that want to have everything inside and nothing outside, which is a kind of populistic transition toward, well, for us, a competent politician is the one who thinks something like us. So I don't vote for a fascist, right? I would never vote for a fascist. So, but within my tribe, I would like to have a person or a representative who has some sensitivity to my problems. And the problems I think crucial, not for me as a person, but for me as part of the citizenry. That is the part of the sovereign people, right? So this mix of ideas and advocacy, what it's politics about. Advocacy, this is what representation is. Advocacy and representativity or representativeness. Yes. There are the two elements that are very important in order to define what is competence in relation to electoral politics.
You want to react to this?
This is striking. It's very, very interesting. I like very much this characterization of politics as advocacy and representation. And what is striking, when I say it's striking, is that you talk about someone who has some sensitivity to my problems, not someone who has some solutions to my problems. That's where the technocrats come in.
Yeah.
So this distinguishing, sensitivity from solution is
problem solving, right?
It's very interesting. Just two things. The problem of representation, also coming from the lotteries, I think it's a very big problem. It's not clear at all. If you're trying to think who would represent me, who would be most similar to me, well, I don't know. I mean, it's very hard to tell. So I completely agree with that. But then there is another question, which is the fact that it's good to see what are the weaknesses of this sortition. But we should also have some solution to what I think is objectively a crisis of democracy, of representative democracy. So it's not that parties are doing so very well that we can just say, look, lotteries would be problematic too. Yeah, sure.
This is an excellent. May I?
Sure.
It's very, very good because now there are in my discipline interesting examples of what to do in terms of discussion. Of course, we cannot tell the citizens what they have to do, but in terms of scholarship, yes. Take the case of one of the most important theorists of representative democracy based on parties, Hans Kelsen, who also wrote one of the most important first book on democracy in 1929, in a situation of despair, because it was the beginning of the Nazi coup d'etat, and then during the Italian fascism. So Europe was attacking frontally party democracy in the name of the unity of the nation, of the people, against conflict and so on and so forth. So he recognized that parties were in a crisis, because otherwise the situation would not be so bad, right? So what to do? So he made an effort to reflect upon what to do. So intervention in legislations, interventions in regulations and whatever, but in order to keep the system consistent to itself. So that is what we want to do. So try to have your imaginations mobilized to find solutions that keep us sovereign as citizens, not one part of us, but all of us, connected to the idea of possibility of changing and not simply solving, but also questioning, and making, assuming that dissent and conflict are not a sense of dysfunctionality, but they can be an opportunity for seeing things in different ways and coming to different solutions. So he thus gave us a vademecum of all the important issues we have to consider if we want to protect democracy in difficult times.
We're almost about the end of our time, so I would like to ask you if there's something else that you want to add to this conversation to close our talk today.
No, I think it's an excellent idea to have these, at least lottery does something good. It makes possible cooperations among scholars of different fields. Close, different though, and important to cooperate. This is good. I think it's an excellent revelation.
Yes, I agree. I think it works very well. There is another function we haven't even begun to discuss, and we will not do it now, which is educating the citizens.
Yes,
so the idea
you kind of touched upon that.
It's amazing how much people were transformed in what I could see. Because I followed the convention later, remotely, and I could see the people being changed. And so there is also a line, I think, in political theory about the role of...
Yeah, I know there are some works that find that mini publics can increase the knowledge and information on the topics and can also decrease polarization, which is a huge topic in American politics, and we know that. But that raises other questions of how are information spread within the mini public? How does that work? Who controls the spread of information?
Yeah, this is a huge issue.
And this is a huge issue, and unfortunately we won't have the time. So maybe we'll have another episode on this topic, because it seems like it brings together many different subfields within this discipline and even other disciplines as well.
I think so.
This is gonna be very huge, I guess, in the following months and years, right? We would like to close super quickly with a more personal question about you, to know you not only as a professor, but as, let's say, person that have their own experience, and sometimes students are very interested in that. We know you as great scholars and authors of famous books, but we would like to know, if you hadn't become an academic, what do you think you would have done in your life? What was your sliding door moment?
I don't know.
That's the most difficult question for
I don't know. Perhaps I have a desire, a great desire never fulfilled, to write novels.
That's interesting.
I'm not capable of. I tried many times. It's difficult for me. That would be my desire.
So we'll go ahead with more
Yeah.
books on politics.
So you actually took my answer away. That's what I really wanted to be. I wanted to be a writer, and then I
too.
realized I had nothing to say, and that was terrible.
Anyway, I
So
cannot
I
construct.
said, okay.
I cannot construct a plot.
That's okay. Let's become a journalist. And so I started studying economics so that I could become a journalist, and then that took a life of its own.
Instead of plots, we have arguments.
Exactly.
But that's interesting in another way. So thank you very much
Thank
for
you too.
being here for this conversation. Maybe we'll have a follow-up, who knows, because we still have a lot to talk about. Thank you again for listening to this episode of our podcast. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, on Instagram, so follow us and wait for the next episode. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.